Measuring competitive performance using indicators. In this presentation, we'll talk about the importance of measuring competitive performance. To introduce the basic concept of an important metric of competitive performance, the indicator. We'll talk about how indicators are used in competition, and then we'll introduce a specific form of the indicator called the average bout indicator, which is particularly useful for evaluating performance from one competition to the next. We'll talk about the relationship between victory rate and the average bout indicator, and how to set appropriate goals for your fencing training. A common principle in business, engineering, academics, and sports is that to improve, one must measure performance. Now, a simple metric for fencing and sports in general is to tally victories versus defeats. This information can be boiled down to one number in terms of a victory rate, representing the percentage of bouts which result in victory. Unfortunately, the victory rate is a very crude metric, especially for novices who may log relatively few victories in their early competitions. The solution is to calculate a more precise statistic known as an indicator. The basic concept of the indicator is simple. We simply take the touches scored and the touches received, recorded for every bout, and look at the difference between them. By subtracting the number of touches received from the number of touches scored, we arrive at a number called the indicator. For example, in a single bout, positive indicator represents a victory, a negative indicator, a defeat. A 5-0 victory would earn an indicator value of +5, a narrow 5-4 victory, an indicator of +1. A similarly narrow defeat would yield an indicator of -1, and at the extreme, a 5-0 defeat would yield an indicator of -5. Now, indicators can be calculated in this way for individual bouts, but typically they're calculated over an entire competition. The results of such a calculation are used to break ties among fencers with the same number of victories or victory rate. The problem with this kind of gross indicator calculation is that it's difficult to interpret the indicators that result. The meaning of an indicator depends on the number of bouts that are fenced. You can't meaningfully compare indicators based on different numbers of bouts from one competition to the next. To solve this problem, we can make another simple calculation, the average bout indicator. Simply take the indicator calculated over multiple bouts, however many that is, and then divide by the number of bouts to arrive at the ABI, or average bout indicator, which now is conceptually similar to the indicator that you would calculate in a single bout. For example, an ABI of +3 suggests an expected 5-2 victory against a hypothetical average opponent. An ABI of +1 corresponds to an expected result of 5-4 victory. An ABI of 0 corresponds to a bout that's too close to call against that hypothetical average opponent. An ABI of -1 corresponds to an expected 4-5 defeat. An ABI of -3 corresponds to an expected 2-5 defeat. Now, of course, all of these expectations are defined with respect to an average opponent. The expected result against a weaker opponent would be better. The expected result against a stronger opponent would naturally be worse. So what does all this mean in terms of our expected victory rate? The relationship between our expected victory rate and our ABI depends on the distribution of strength and skill among our opponents. Are we facing a pool of many fencers all at approximately the same level? Are there a lot of strong fencers with a few weak ones? Or are there a few strong fencers standing out from a weak field of competitors? Or most likely, are we looking at a normal distribution, so-called bell curve, with a lot of fencers grouped in the middle and only a few outliers at the extreme of very strong and very weak? Rather than speculate about the demographics of our competition, let's look at some actual data. This chart presents the results of the 2021 NFC number 1 women's épée competition. Here, the observed victory rate for every athlete in the competition who managed to achieve at least one victory is plotted on the vertical axis against the corresponding average bout indicator for that athlete on the horizontal axis. And we don't have to do too much in the way of sophisticated analysis to see some useful patterns. First of all, we can see that below -3, average bout indicator, the corresponding victory rate is near 0. On the other hand, with an average bout indicator much greater than 3, +3, the corresponding victory rate approaches 100%. An average bout indicator of 0 corresponds very closely to an expected victory rate of 50%, with most of the points falling pretty close to a line between the -3 and the +3. Now, not all of the data from every competition is going to fall in line quite so neatly, but the conclusions that we can draw from this graph will hold pretty reliably across most of the competitions that we're going to face. Namely, within that -3 to +3 indicator range, if one trains and is able to improve one's average bout indicator by 1 touch per bout, one can expect to increase one's victory rate by approximately 15%. The acronym SMART is used to summarize common advice for setting effective goals. Effective goals should be specific, measurable, ambitious but realistic, and timed. Now, how can we apply this to setting goals in fencing? Well, first of all, if we say, for example, my goal is to improve my average bout indicator by a certain amount at the next tournament or by the end of the season, then we're setting a goal that is specific, measurable, and timed. Now, the decision about how much we hope to and plan to increase our ABI is a matter of finding the right balance between a goal that's ambitious enough to be inspiring and motivating and one that's realistic enough to be achievable. In this presentation, we've talked about the importance of measuring competitive performance And we've introduced the basic concept of an indicator, a statistic that's widely used in the fencing world. We've examined how the indicator is used in fencing competition, and we've introduced the concept of the average bout indicator, a statistic that can be derived from any of the more common indicator results, and that is particularly useful for setting goals and comparing performance from one competition to the next. We've examined the relationship between the expected victory rate and the average bout indicator, and I hope that in covering all of this material, we helped to establish a foundation for setting effective, smart goals for improving your competitive performance.